Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's 10 a.m. briefing, which features embargoed research from the open access journal Science Advances. The research paper to be discussed this morning is called The Limits of Human Predictions of Recidivism. The speakers on this briefing are Jen Scheme, Professor of Social Welfare and Public Policy at Berkeley, Zhongbing Zheng, data scientist and recent PhD graduate from Stanford, and Jerry Lin, PhD student in the Stanford Computer Science Department. A reminder that this paper is embargoed until 11 a.m. Pacific tomorrow or 2 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time tomorrow, Friday. So we appreciate no one tweeting about it during the presentation this morning. Also, I would ask you to please let the speakers leave the room at about 45 minutes after the hour so we can prepare for the next briefing. There will be a follow-up room if you have additional questions. And now, our first speaker, Dr. Scheme.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm going to overview the study's context and findings. Then my colleagues will detail our methods and results. We do have some slides. There we go. Just as background, risk assessments are data-driven evaluations of people that characterize their likelihood of reoffending. These algorithms characterize risk by assigning scores to risk factors like criminal history. Risk assessments have been around for decades, but big data and predictive analytics have expanded their reach. Demand for risk assessment has also increased in this era of criminal justice reform. Jurisdictions are working to reduce high rates of incarceration without compromising public safety. They're using risk assessment to support these efforts. One way to safely reduce incarceration is to identify the people who are least likely to reoffend and release them. Risk assessments are designed to predict reoffending and can be helpful in that regard. Risk assessment can also be used to identify higher risk people who will benefit from services shown to reduce recidivism. Advocates recommend that judges and others consider risk assessment to improve their accuracy when risk is relevant to the decisions they have to make. This recommendation is based on over 65 years' worth of research indicating that algorithmic prediction outperforms human prediction. But recently, Dressel and Farid published a high-profile study that questions the value of risk assessment. These authors recruited people online to read vignettes and predict whether the defendant depicted would reoffend. They compared human predictions with those of a risk assessment called COMPAS, and found COMPAS was no more accurate than these people without justice expertise. But a closer look at this study indicates people's predictions were elicited in a way that doesn't represent predictions that are made daily by judges in the real world. Our study tested the limits of these findings, focusing on two factors. First, we varied whether the information provided for prediction was streamlined or enriched. Dressel and Farid provided only 5 bits of information about a defendant, like gender and age. In the real world, judges' predictions are based on a wealth of information, from pre-sentence investigation reports to the defendant's demeanor in the court. We found that when more information was provided and was useful for prediction, risk assessment was more accurate than human judgment. Second, we varied whether humans were provided with feedback on the accuracy of their predictions. Dressel and Farid provided humans with 50 learning trials. On each trial, the person made a prediction and was immediately told whether they were correct before moving on to the next. This creates a kind learning environment that's much different from the ones that are wicked, where judges make predictions. Judges cannot know immediately, or in some cases for years, whether the person will reoffend. We found that when feedback was not provided, risk assessment was more accurate than human judgment. Our conclusion is that risk assessments can outperform human predictions of recidivism in contexts that look like criminal justice settings. Our results are consistent with those of field-based research that compare algorithms with judicial and correctional officer predictions. This restores the basic rationale for considering risk assessment when risk is a legally relevant factor for what is ultimately a human decision. But risk assessment has to be coupled with sound policy choices to achieve fair criminal justice reform. Next, John Bin will present our method.
Hi. So I'm Zhong Bin, and I'm just going to walk through how we conducted our study. So we did this much like the previous Dressel and Farid study. We recruited online participants through Amazon Mechanical Turk. And like Jen just mentioned, we varied our study to theirs by expanding in 2 dimensions, which were, first we vary the amount of information, so it's either streamlined or enriched. And then we also varied whether the participants get feedback or not. And from this quadrant, four pieces, Dressler for each study falls into this quadrant here. You have streamlined information, and you're also getting feedback. So now let's pretend that you kind of all participated in our study, and you go online, and you open the survey, and you happen to be assigned randomly to this quadrant. What you'd see is a case description like this. It basically has those 5 informations boiled down to a vignette. It tells you age, gender, some criminal history. Another thing that we did differently from the previous study is instead of asking you to evaluate just yes or no, will this person reoffend, we asked the participants to assess risk on a probability scale. So we ask you, hey, do you think this person is almost certainly not going to be rearrested or almost certainly arrested? So we give you the spectrum to choose from. And this is important because the decision is not a yes or no decision. It's actually a risk assessment. You have to assess multiple defendants and decide where they fall on in the spectrum. And the 6-point scale actually isn't granular enough that once you make a selection, we expand it and ask you to elaborate within that bucket. So in total, we have a 30-point probability scale where we ask participants to evaluate risk, which is more realistic. Now, this is what you'd see if you were in the streamlined condition. But if you had been assigned to the enriched information condition, for the identical case, you would see something like this. There's a lot more information there, more detail, but it still has all the information that is in the streamlined condition, of course. And these highlights, I just highlighted myself to show in contrast, but what you'd actually see is this unhighlighted version, right? So you just see a block of black text, and you ask the same question, evaluate this case. Now, what happens when you hit that submit button depends also on your initial assignment, where you're in the feedback group or in the non-feedback group. Now, if you were in the feedback group, like the Dressler and Farid participants, you'd immediately see, hey, you said like this person was closer to not offending, and guess what, you were right. Or actually, this person did reoffend. So you get immediate feedback on your judgment that you just made, and then you'd move on to the next question. But if you were not in the feedback condition, if you were in the no feedback condition, the moment you had pressed that submit button, you just see another case. No feedback whatsoever. And you'd continue doing that over 50 cases. And if you were in the streamlined condition, you would keep seeing streamlined cases. If you were in the enriched condition, you would keep seeing that block of black text every time you hit that submit button without any feedback. So just to recap, our overall design is this 2x2 design. And when a participant enters the system, they're assigned randomly to one of these 4 quadrants. Next, Jerry will talk more about our conclusions and results.
All right. So I'm Jerry Lin, and in this part, I'm going to show you some of the results that we have discovered in our study. And particularly, we are going to focus on this measure of accuracy, which measures basically how often one can correctly predict whether an individual is going to reoffend or not. So back in 2018, this Dressler and Farid study, so one of their main discoveries is that they discovered human can make a prediction about recidivism just as accurate as algorithm. So actually, we will be able to successfully replicate the results by showing that in this COMPAS data set, where the algorithm can correctly predict 65% of the recidivism, the human participant in our study under this streamlined condition with immediate feedback were able to achieve a 64% accuracy, which is pretty comparable to the algorithm. However, when we're trying to replicate this exact same setting on another 3 data sets, it turns out actually algorithms substantially outperformed the human being in all 3 other data sets. And what's even worse is that if we start to remove this immediate feedback from the experiment condition, the gap between algorithm and a human being gets even bigger. So I think this result suggests that this such immediate feedback actually plays a very important role in terms of boosting human prediction accuracy. However, we believe that such immediate feedback is actually rarely observed in a more realistic setting. But then another hypothesis that might potentially explain this large gap between algorithm and humans' performance is that maybe just the algorithm has some access to some set of additional information that the humans don't have access to. So kind of to test out this hypothesis, we also test out this enriched condition where we showed some additional set of information to the human participants. However, despite having access to this additional set of information, the human prediction accuracy does not necessarily improve much, and the gap between the algorithm and human performance still persists. So basically, this result just suggests that the human don't necessarily be able to take advantage of this additional set of information. So just to conclude our talk today on this study, so I think one of our main results is that this risk assessment instruments can often outperform unaided human judgment of risk, especially when there's no immediate feedback available. But we do want to emphasize that those risk assessment tools should only be used to estimate risk as opposed to dictating policies. And we also want to note that by using those risk assessment tools can be used in a much broader sense and in many positive ways. So that, for example, we can just provide services and helps to people who we believe they might need those services the most. And we believe that by using those risk assessment tools in such a positive ways, they can really help us create better policies in the future. And thank you.
Great. Thank you. We will now take questions. Kindly raise your hand. A mic will be brought to you. And please state your name and affiliation before your question. We'll start over here.
I'm Tom Keenan from Business Edge in Canada, where we now have protesters on railway tracks who will probably be arrested today. Now think about this. Your data concerns recidivism, but it's based on arresting. And people Jane Fonda got arrested, so shouldn't you really have looked at convictions down the line, not arrest data? Because people get arrested for all kinds of reasons. It's for you, Jennifer, I think.
I can answer that question. There's debate about the use of arrest versus convictions, and we could very easily use convictions rather than arrest as the thing that we're predicting. It's actually even more important to use a criterion for prediction that you think is not subject to selection bias by the police. So something like conviction for a violent offense would be the very best thing to predict. Our focus in this study, though, is on relative predictive accuracy. We're just comparing the ability of humans and algorithms or risk assessment to make predictions, whether that be for arrest, conviction, violent offense, et cetera. And our findings are consistent with research in other domains, including when we're just predicting whether someone is violent in the future. In that domain as well, we tend to see that risk assessments or structured human judgment performs much better than seat of the pants or unaided human intuition.
Question here. The mic is coming.
Hi, Tom Whipple of the Times. I'm wondering why you compare this to lay people rather than judges and probation officers. It feels to me like the people who are involved in the criminal justice system would be the ones making this decision in the real world.
Would you like? So you're absolutely right that the people who are making these decisions every day in the real world are probation officers, parole agents, parole commissioners, judges. The reason that we used lay people in this study was because we started at the Dressel and Fareed point. We wanted to be able to replicate their finding with a similar sample of people without justice expertise, and then really explore the limits of those findings with the sample of lay people. It's much harder, as you would imagine, to study judges, parole agents, probation officers, but there's actually a handful of good studies that do look at their predictions compared to risk assessments, and the findings are very similar. So even with experience and expertise, we don't necessarily find boosts in predictive accuracy for experts.
And the Dressel and Fareed study, just to emphasize, was published in Science Advances in 2018. So it's on our archived press packages if you'd need to see it. Okay. Maybe while we wait for the next question, I was wondering, and you alluded a little bit to this, Jen, but are there domains where algorithms and humans are pitted against each other and humans continue to always outperform algorithms? There are research areas like that?
The short answer is no. So this is a line of research that's been going on since the 1950s, when Paul Meehl divided the world into statistical or algorithmic prediction on the one hand and human prediction on the other. So this has been looked at in many different domains, from healthcare to criminal justice to other sorts of issues. And the consistent finding If you look at meta-analyses, so the types of studies that combine the results of lots of individual investigations, the consistent finding is that humans tend to perform more poorly than risk assessments. So in some studies you will find that they perform similarly, but if you look in the aggregate, typically statistical or algorithmic prediction is pulling ahead. I would say that the one domain where humans can be better at prediction is when we reduce their discretion. So if we ask them to consider a list of risk factors consistently when they're making decisions, that can just help them be more consistent, which can help them be more accurate. And it's also much like what we saw in Dressel and Farid when we're consistently presenting people with a list of 5 very predictive factors for recidivism.
Okay, question here in the second row, and then we'll have one behind.
Hi, Sarah Napton from The Telegraph in London. We've been having a spate of terror attacks back in the UK with offenders who were in jail and then have been released on parole and then have gone on to commit offences. I just wondered if you thought algorithms could help in that instance, help parole boards be able to spot those people before they go out and commit further crimes.
I will give my opinion and then ask my colleagues to weigh in too. Most risk assessments and algorithms are designed to predict reoffending that's common, relatively common. So even violent offending has a high enough base rate that we can develop a pretty good idea about what sorts of factors predict those outcomes. There's less known so far about terrorism, in part because it's a lower base rate outcome. So I think research is just developing on that front. You won't find nearly as many validated algorithms or risk assessments that predict that outcome. I don't know if you'd like to weigh in.
Yeah, like I think I very much agree with that thing, just because I think a lot of this either risk assessment tools or just like more like algorithms in general, especially those like a modern statistical method, they usually like reliance on relatively a large sample of data where we observe enough of this behavior so that we can start to draw like statistical association between the outcome that we're trying to predict, in this case some sort of a terrorism behavior with some observable factor, right? But I think in this like but that's also something that happens very rarely. So I think that might just be hard, just given this like a low base rate example, in order to make a very effective prediction on this thing.
But I just like to add, I agree with both my colleagues that no, we probably won't be able to build a system that can tell you the likelihood of someone, like pick out the potential terrorist for you. No, that's unrealistic. But I think what these algorithmic or systematic risk assessments can help you do is not be biased by the fact that we've recently seen these terrorisms like increase. Right? You see these immediate fearful responses. Once you see these events, people will respond to them, and now suddenly everybody kind of looks like a terrorist, right? But statistically, we know that this is a very unlikely event that just happened, right? And I think this is where the human accuracy might kind of fall, in that we are biased towards many different things, like recency bias or not understanding the base rate of events, and only systematical approaches can help us avoid those biases that we all have inside ourselves. That's what I think, yeah.
Good question. Question here.
Thank you. Clive Cookson from the FT, also from London. Can you tell us about the algorithm that's used here, the COMPAS? Because presumably that's quite an old system, and with new AI-based systems, I would guess that computers will pull further ahead of humans. Can you just say how this system could be improved in the future?
Yeah, actually, I think despite I think COMPAS has been out there for a while, but I think just in terms of this recidivism behavior, I think the algorithm's capability actually is being much limited by the kind of facts that we are able to observe, and also like often being available in the data set, right? So yeah, so I think I think nowadays, it's like I think we heard like all sorts of news stories about like how well AI can perform in like many different tasks. But I think for this like particular task in terms of predicting recidivism, I think actually only a few of those most relevant factors actually has already been able to achieve some really good predictive outcome. And I think it's actually relatively hard for us to actually build anything that can significantly go beyond this, at least at this moment, as far as I know.
Go ahead.
I'd just like to add, so another project that we had a few years back was comparing quite simple algorithmic rules versus more complex black box AI models. And we found that these complex models maybe can increase your accuracy by, say, 2-3 percentage points. But the ultimate thing, I think, important thing here is, like we've been saying, these models help us predict risk. They're not there to make a decision for us. Ultimately, this is a human decision. This is a policy decision. And one argument that we've made in the previous study is, when you're making a human decision, it's not only the accuracy that matters. It's the transparency and the human understanding of what's going on, why this prediction happened. And compared to 2-3 percentage point increases in accuracy, there might be much more value in just adoption, for example, when a judge understands why this one defendant is riskier than the other. So I think that kind of answers more to the question of, do we see AI coming to save us all?
To add just briefly to what's been said, which I agree with completely, we don't tend to find much added benefit when we get more complex models or more sophisticated machine learning algorithms. So as was just said, sometimes you can achieve the same level of predictive accuracy with just a couple of risk factors than you would with these really complicated approaches that look for all kinds of interactions. And in this context, when we're talking about decision making in the justice system, it seems important to place a premium on transparency. So it's very important for us to know what's going into a prediction so that it can be challenged, assessed, and evaluated.
Question over here.
My understanding is Mechanical Turk is populated by people who don't have jobs and want to make very small amounts of money. Isn't it a bizarre sample for a study like this? I mean, I know if you went out on a campus, you'd get a bias, but Mechanical Turk strikes me as one of the worst possible sampling strategies. It's easy. Agreed to that.
Yes.
Why didn't you use something else?
So why we didn't do something else is, again, because we wanted to follow this very high-profile study by Dressel and Farid and replicate their basic result before we extended it. We really wanted to test within this context the limits of that finding. They did, yes.
They send, so you continued.
When this paper publishes tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, what policy discussions are happening that it will inform, in particular, where it might inform how much human versus risk assessment involvement there should be in certain recidivism predictions?
So I think this paper in some way gets us back to first base, where it's important to consider the use of risk assessment when we have to make these human decisions, ultimately. So this paper is very much about accuracy and relative accuracy of humans versus algorithms. The finding bears directly on the value of risk assessment in these contexts. There would be no point in using a risk assessment or algorithm if it didn't help us be more accurate in forecasting reoffending. Most of the discussion right now about risk assessment and justice reform focuses on a different issue, and that issue is about bias. Concerns that the use of risk assessment will bake in bias or increase racial disparities in incarceration. There's mixed support for that notion. We don't know whether the use of risk assessment will increase, decrease, or have no effect on very big existing racial disparities in incarceration. And we suspect that the answer to that question will depend on what local practices are being replaced. We've thought a lot about bias in algorithms. All of us have published in that area, and we continue to do so. It's just that this particular study doesn't focus on that issue. This is about the more fundamental issue of accuracy and helpfulness.
Question. Well, let's go here. Thanks, and then we'll come over.
Thank you very much, Lee Holtz, The Wall Street Journal. Just to follow up on that for a moment, if I may. So I realize this is not the subject of the paper at hand, but you've raised the issue of bias in the data. I wonder, as a matter of policy, seeking to increase transparency for this kind of decision making in the criminal justice system. I mean, what's the thinking from your standpoint about how to engender trust in these systems as we go forward?
I think that's a pivotal issue. I'll give a brief response and then pass it along. Transparency and consistency and accuracy, those are really the main reasons to consider using risk assessment at all. And right now, without the benefit of risk assessment, we're in a place where a young black man is 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than a young white man. So I think that the issues are real, the concerns are real. I also think that unlike black box decisions that are made within human heads, we can build trust with algorithms and risk assessments by having conversations, by developing the instruments carefully with attention to bias and equity, and looking at outcomes to answer that question about whether, again, we're exacerbating, mitigating, or having no effect on existing disparities in incarceration.
Yeah, I think this is also like part of the reason why, like, I think in recent years, I think there's a lot of effort in the academia is trying to like advancing this sort of like interpret model as opposed to using those like good, like well-performing black box models, right? So I think a lot of them is that to make this model like transparent or simple enough so that those models and also the relevant policy can be easily like evaluated, assessed, and also interrogated, right? So that this like a policymaker really have the final say about the policy that is being eventually executed, right? As opposed to have the algorithm being dictating the policy, right? So I think transparency, I think that comes from a lot of places, but I think the model transparency and also the ability to like evaluate the policy is an important factor for building trust in this area.
I'd just like to add, I think I agree with all the things, but what feels very viscerally important to me is that we have very difficult and subtle discussions. Because I sit down in a room with someone and often you find they have their opinions about something, but everything is so more subtle than this. Even our study, there's a lot of subtlety that we just can't present within like this 10-minute time span. And things regarding race, gender, discrimination, there's a lot of arguments to like why algorithms do better and why they're probably very dangerous. And I think we should, as a society, like come down and talk about the very details of these things and make that decision very cognizantly. We shouldn't like blanket over, hey, algorithms are all bad, or like, hey, algorithms are the future and they're going to save our lives. We have to like selectively talk about this, and I'd like to see more of that discussion happen, more about more into the detail and the depths of why certain things are bad, why certain things are good, and what we might do as a society to deal with these issues.
Just a quick follow-up on that to clarify before we go to the next question. Is there a trade-off between explainability and transparency when you're building an algorithm? Like if you're trying to make it really something that can be explained, are you going to sacrifice something in accuracy or not so much?
Not so much.
So I'll say in general, that depends on the context. But in these cases where we're dealing with humans, which are like known to be not very predictable, I think we don't lose that much because we don't have a lot of predictability in the first place.
To just add to that, I think that we can and should have relatively simple, transparent, accurate algorithms and risk assessments. That part's easy to achieve. The part that needs more attention is the user interface. So how does that risk assessment information get interpreted and filtered through humans? Because ultimately it's the judge still who's making the decision about pretrial release, for example.
Question here.
Hi, Tom Whipple of the Times again. On that sort of point, could you just, I know you've been talking around this, but could you say what you consider at present to be the ideal? If you were to set up a criminal justice system, and I'm a judge going through a list of offenders, looking at early release or whatever, how do you imagine I interact with the algorithm interacts with me? What would you set up if you were a dictator of the world's judicial systems?
Well, I don't have thoughts that are quite that grand, but I can give you one example of a model that certainly has problems, like many do in implementation. But one of the earliest models where this has been used is in Virginia. Again, we have research indicating that there are problems with the model, but the basic idea is that risk assessment, a very transparent one, is used to identify people who are at low likelihood of reoffending. And when judges are leaning toward a decision that someone is going to be incarcerated in jail or prison, and the risk assessment indicates that that person is actually unlikely to reoffend, the judge gets asked to consider that in perhaps recommending alternative sanctions. So that's one example where, at least in theory, you could help unwind mass incarceration without compromising public safety. Again, everything. The devil is in the details when it comes to implementing these things, but that's just one concrete sliver of what could be done. Risk assessment is being applied in all kinds of ways, though, and is also, I think, really useful in its most classic form to inform the kind of services that someone should get when they're on probation if we really want to reduce the risk of reoffending.
I have another case study example for you that might be helpful. There was a project that I worked on in my second year during my PhD program, and the initial project was a grand district attorney's office somewhere wanted us to help them get an algorithm to identify the most riskiest defendants at arraignment, who will fail to appear. We built this transparent model that showed, hey, it turns out a bunch of teenagers are very likely to fail to appear. But the result of that wasn't saying, hey, you're very risky, we're gonna set bail for you. It was, oh, we should reroute this population to a different program that will help them appear at their court date because they probably just don't know better. So I think it's this kind of interaction that can help, right? It's not blindly following some suggestions, it's using these tools to better understand what's going on and then making the right decisions.
Yeah, and also just to add to the example that John Bin provided, actually I think that's also one of the ongoing effort in our research lab is kind of to use this sort of a similar tools to assess, say for example in this case, right, to assess the likelihood of someone to fail appear at the courtroom, and we will use that to actually identify people who might just need need the help the most, right? So that we actually be able to maybe provide them with, say, transportation help, or just maybe just send them text message reminders, so that we can use those risk assessment tools in this positive ways, as opposed to doing anything that we're trying to avoid here.
Question there?
Thank you, Clive Cookson again. I just wanted to come back to the system that was actually assessed rather than hypothetical better ones or other ones. COMPAS, do you regard that as being fair, transparent, and free of bias? I mean, I just don't know how complex it is. Presumably, if there's a list of things, a human could do it themselves rather than having a computer go through. I just want to get a bit of better idea about the system that's actually being used.
So the COMPAS is not the only risk assessment that we examined in this study. We also examined the level of services inventory. That's the focus when we're providing 10 risk factors rather than only the 5 of focus in the COMPAS study. Speaking only for myself and knowing that not all people would approve of this opinion, I will say that I do not regard COMPAS as a terrific instrument, and the first, second, and third reason for that is that it is not transparent. So there's actually been a federal court case that challenged the lack of transparency of the COMPAS. It's designated by its proprietors as privileged information, the algorithm or formula that's actually applied to the many, many items that are asked as part of the COMPAS that would be most predictive. So Again, we started where Dressel and Farid left off, and that was with COMPAS and 5 risk factors. And then we tested the limits of that by looking at more complex information under the framework of this other instrument called the Level of Services Inventory.
Can you remind us again when you went from 5 factors to 10 factors, what those additional 5 were, and why do you think humans had trouble with them when they didn't do better when they got that information? Why?
I think there are several factors, right? So I think the first ones is that basically I think those 5 factors we present at the beginning, actually those are the most relevant factors with the behavior of recidivism, at least statistically, right? So basically when you add those additional set of information, certainly they help actually. We actually will be able to observe that if we are able to train our own models on those, using those additional factors, the model can actually do better. But I think just that, so that's kind of one of the first reasons, just that those additional factors are not as relevant as those first 5 factors. But also just that, I think, as the example that Jianbin showed during his presentation, just that when you present people with a large blob of text, I think people, people are usually having a hard time trying to discern, basically what are the most relevant ones versus some irrelevant ones. So I think that will just create a harder learning curve for people to follow.
Question here in the second row. The mic is coming. Thank you, Andrea.
Well, while it's coming, I'll just add to kind of underscore a point that Jerry made. It's not so much that humans do worse when they're provided with more information, at least not in this study. It's that algorithms were better able to make use of the information. So when the additional information was predictive and useful, the algorithms were able to weight that and pull ahead in terms of predictive accuracy. So when you move beyond simple factors like age, sex, priors, current offense, and add additional information, which is sometimes predictive, like substance use, employment problems, attitudes supportive of crime, you're finding that when that's useful information, the algorithms and risk assessments are improved in their accuracy for prediction, but that's not the case for humans.
Sarah from the Telegraph again. Is it possible to hack this system? Could members of the mob get in and maybe change it so you could get out?
Well, I like that question. It's actually, so I have been a psychologist for a long time and used to do assessments in clinical practice, and the concern always was about hacking and malingering and what happens when somebody understands what the special sauce is and they can manipulate the system. That seems unlikely to happen with most risk assessments because we've known for a long time when we have designed these and implemented them in justice settings where people do know what is being implemented in probation and parole, for example. It's usually based both on, there's multiple sources of information. So the information comes from records like rap sheets or other sorts of administrative databases that can't be manipulated, and also sometimes based on clinical or professional interviews with people who understand what kinds of questions to ask for, what to look for as corroborating evidence when they're scoring some of these risk assessments.
Question from a viewer online. Thanks.
All right, this question is from Nicolas Luco from El Mercurio in Santiago, Chile. He asks, would you need more local data to transfer your model to another culture, like in Europe, or would you just need to add the geographical location as a new factor?
Yeah, I think definitely, I think just those risk factors will vary from place to place, and definitely, I think so I think definitely that will be more than just actually we will need more than just a geographical location in order to calibrate the similar system to another geolocation. I think in general, I think the rule of thumb is actually the more data we have about a specific area, the better we can learn about the particular area and also the human behavior in that area. So yes, we probably need more data.
All right. That was well timed. Our last question is just about 45 minutes after the hour. I can note if there are additional questions you may have for the speakers, room 208 across the hall will be available. But thank you so much to our speakers for a very interesting discussion. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.